We have a lot to cover in a short period of time. We are recording this conversation, so you'll definitely be able to rewatch and play it back as well. Again, my name is Anna V. Eskamani, proudly serving District 42 in the Florida State Legislature. And I'm actually joining you from my car at my virtual office as I am outside the Orange County Firefighters Association, as we're also hosting an in-person town hall here at 5 o'clock, in alongside Senator Bill Smith and others. And so have a pretty packed evening after town hall. I'm heading over to CF for our high school commencement ceremony. So it's a pretty busy afternoon for me, but not the opportunity to provide a overview of the Florida budget. And what we're talking about tonight is the process of Florida budget being analyzed. How does our budget intersect federal funding? And of course, what can you do to advocate for funding on issues you care about? And we will be specific honing in on public education. As part of the question and conversations we've been getting, constituents revolve around the impact of the federal budget on the state budget, on our needs, experiences. And then, of course, I'm concerned about defunding public education and the impact of the state budget on things like AP classes, IB classes, Cambridge courses, and so forth. A lot to cover in a short period of time. I am going to do my best to keep track of the questions that are coming in. Um, have no issues doing that disclaimer that of my office environment, my virtual office environment, because my schedule is so packed time. So that said, I'm gonna ask our team to okay, I'm back. Sorry, I think I might have gotten disconnected for a moment there. Let me go ahead and reshare my screen and let's dive in. Okay, perfect. So as a reminder, we do have closed captioning that is available. You can activate closed captioning with the steps provided um, in this slide to describe it for folks. If you want to turn on your captions, you have the option on Facebook and on Zoom. So you can select that option. It's the little icon that says CC on the bottom of your screen. And so don't be shy to turn on that option. As a reminder, District 42, where we're proud to represent, includes the heart of Orange County. So we represent the communities of Orlando, Belle Isle, Winter Park, Edgewood, Maitland, Eatonville, and of course, parts of unincorporated Orange County. If you don't know who your state representative is, I really do encourage you to find out. You can scan this QR code, or of course, you can also visit flhouse.gov and just click on the representative link, and then you can actually find who your state representative is, who your member of Congress is, who's your state senator, and so forth. And I really do encourage folks to do that research, as it's important to know not only who represents you, but these are the folks that are going to be voting on your behalf on issues like the state budget. And it's really important that you hold them accountable. A lot of attention goes to the White House and what's happening in the federal level of our government, which is very important. But of course, state government is where issues like funding for public education, for uh, environmental protection, funding for transportation issues, all of it comes from your state budget. So it's important to know who represents you in Tallahassee. Now, last week, we actually provided a more thorough review of Florida's legislative session. So if you do want to rewatch that, we have a link to it. I'm going to ask our team if you can drop that YouTube link in the chat for folks. But we did provide a more substantive review of the 2025 legislative session, which we're technically still in right now, because we don't have a budget, which is the heart of today's conversation. This Zoom came together based on feedback from those who attended last week's virtual review, who wanted a more thorough understanding of the state budget, how the state budget comes together, and what roles can you play in impact. So that is the purpose of today's review, is to really hone in on the state budget. But if you do want to learn more about the policy fights and the policy bills that we stopped or the policy bills that passed, please check out last week's Zoom, as it does provide a more thorough dive into those topics. As a quick reminder, Florida's legislative session is constitutionally required to be 60 days long. It does go longer, as we're experiencing right now. There's a combination of committee weeks that kick off the pre-session planning, and then session this year started on March 4th. Our one constitutional responsibility as state representatives and state senators is to pass a balanced budget. And our fiscal year starts July 1st. So we're about to approach the beginning of June, and we don't yet have a finalized state budget. And as you can imagine, this is creating a lot of stress for everyone, right? Whether you are a state worker, whether you are a teacher, whether you are a nonprofit that works with state government and you're reliant on grants and contracts with state government, this uncertainty is weighing heavy on our community members. And of course, it's made even more difficult because we're also watching the federal government and the budget that the US House passed. And this budget defunds some really essential programs with the state of Florida. And so, of course, our conversation tonight is more focused on the state budget, but I will highlight some ways that the federal government intersects with the state of Florida. So, real quick, what is an extended session? So, an extended session is when regular legislative session is extended beyond the original regular session calendar. We were supposed to end legislative session on May 2nd. Obviously, that has not happened. And both chambers agreed to an extended session up until June 6th. But at this point, we actually don't know if we're going to go back to Tallahassee next week. It seems highly unlikely. So, what is potentially going to happen is June 6th will come and go. And if the Florida Senate doesn't extend their extended session to June 30th, which is what the House has done, then session will end. The 2025 session will end regardless of if there's a budget or not by June 6th. And then the governor can call a special session, or the legislature can call a special session, but we will have to go back to Tallahassee at some point in June to work on this budget. So with that said, we are in a place of limbo at this time, and it is, of course, creating a lot of concerns for many, many different stakeholders. As a reminder, this is the makeup of the Florida legislature. So the Florida House has 72.5% Republican lawmakers. The rest is Democrat. It's about 33 Democrats out of 120 members. And the Florida Senate is um, uh, right now, out of 40 members, 11 Democrats, one NPA, and then 28 Republicans. So you can see the makeup of the legislature. And of course, this also speaks to who sets the agenda. Where the Republican Party is in charge of both chambers and the governor's office. So they set the agenda of what bills are prioritized, what budget items are prioritized, and they are the ones currently trying to agree on the framework of a budget, which I will talk about soon. Now, I reviewed this slide last week as well, so I'm not going to spend as much time on it because I've talked about this a lot. But it is a really important illustration of Florida's current state budget and how money is spent. And so you can see that the 2023 to 2024 budget was a little over $117 billion. It's billion with a B. You can see the breakdown of where that money Hey everyone, sorry about that. As you can tell, my office car is not working for me, but I will keep going and hopefully we'll have no interruption. So let me go ahead and reshare my screen again. I appreciate y'all's patience with me in technology today. All right, I'm gonna get this back up and running. So as I was mentioning, you can see the large spending responsibilities that we have with your tax dollars. And that brings me to this final category as well that walks us through where spending comes from. Where does the revenue come from? And what I really want to emphasize is the federal dollars, right? So Florida is reliant on the support of the federal government. $37.9 billion of our budget comes from the federal government. This is often the shape of reimbursements through programs like Medicaid. It also can be block grants. It also can be FEMA reimbursements. And without it, we are in trouble. We require this type of support to balance our budget. You can also see 30.2 billion from state trust funds, which I'll talk about in a second of what that is. And then the bulk of our budget comes from what's called general revenue. So these are dollars that are generated typically through what's called a use tax. And you might know that as a sales tax. So when you buy items at a store and you pay 6 pennies per dollar, that is a use tax, a consumption tax, and that goes into state coffers. Your county might charge a little bit more. For example, Orange County has a half a penny that's on top of the 6 cents. So our sales tax in Orange County is 6.5. And that half cent is a local referendum. It was approved by voters to go to public education. So other counties will have different taxation on sales tax based on what local residents have agreed to. With that said, there's also the tourism development tax, the TDT, and that is an option of potentially 6 pennies that can be attached to a hotel room. And of course, that can generate additional revenue for local governments, but there are restrictions on how the bed tax is spent. And that does not go to the state of Florida. That stays local with some restrictions established by the state. But the most important source of revenue as it pertains to general revenue, which is the money that we have the most flexibility with, is going to be sales tax, some corporate income tax, and a few other different types of consumption taxes. But it's important to remember that federal dollars are more restricted. State trust funds are typically more restricted, but they do get rated at times. And then GR is the most flexible funding source. But all of this is from the taxpayer, right? You are contributing to the state budget in different ways, but it's ultimately your money, your contributions that then the legislature reallocates into different areas and needs. So I wanted to quickly talk about trust funds because we mention these a lot, but we don't always provide more clear examples. So Florida has tens of trust funds, and trust funds are essentially more they're a specific bucket of money that is meant for a specific issue or need. And I just want to highlight a few examples for you to be aware of. For example, the Florida Forever Trust Fund is supposed to support land acquisition for conservation and recreation purposes. I know I'm getting a lot of emails right now from folks asking us to fully fund Florida Forever because oftentimes this trust fund, the dollars generated into it will get pulled to pay for other things. You also have the Educational Enhancement Trust Fund. This is funded by lottery revenue to fund public education. One of the misnomers about this is that the Florida Lottery is not necessarily used to increase education funding. Oftentimes, it's used to replace GR that would go to education funding, but now goes to something else because the Florida Lottery revenue is replacing it. So there's a larger conversation about the regressive nature of our tax structure, but it's important for folks to remember that the Florida Lottery is not necessarily increasing funding for public education. It's just shifting GR to something else. You also have the Water Quality Assurance Trust Fund, the State Transportation Trust Fund, this is a trust fund that you contribute to when you buy gas. So whenever you buy gas at a gas station and you paying a tax there, that is split between your local government and the state of Florida, and it is primarily spent on transportation projects. So road improvements, hopefully more public transportation, right? We fight for that in the legislature, but a lot of it goes towards like roads and bridges and state infrastructure for transportation. And then you also have the state operated institutions inmate welfare trust fund. We actually recently increased the cap on this trust fund because it was capped at a very low amount. I believe it was $6 million. And because Florida has such a large incarcerated population, this revenue is generated by the incarcerated. So, the incarcerated, when they buy items from the canteen in a prison, uh, that revenue goes into this trust fund and it's supposed to be reinvested back into improving programs and rehabilitative opportunities in the prison system. But because it was capped, extra money beyond that cap was going into GR. So we actually were able to increase the threshold of this trust fund. So dollars generated by the incarcerated go back to their programmatic needs and so forth. So another example of a trust fund that you might not know about, but does exist in Florida and in Florida state budget. Um, I see some questions in the chat. Let me see if I can grab these real quick. So if they close the extended session and open a special session, does that eliminate any bills that are still outstanding? It's a great question, Leslie. So if the governor calls a special session, it would his call would outline what issues can be discussed. So it's hard for me to predict what will be in that call if that is what happens, but it typically would be more narrow. So it would say, this special session is for the state budget, right? But do remember that even budget bills can be policy bills. And an example I can give you is every conforming bill. So I'm gonna go over this in more detail, but we have the General Appropriations Act as the main budget bill, but then every silo has a conforming bill that outlines how the money will be spent. And so that language can include policy. So, for example, there was a preemption on fertilizer ordinances that was snuck into the natural resources conforming bill. So, even if the call for special session is more narrow, doesn't mean that every policy issue is dead. So it's important for us to be aware of that. Um, yeah, so Title I fund, example of federal dollars that support the state. What needs to be funded and what can be cut? It's a great question. I mean, I would argue that like there is opportunities, for example, to reduce spending in the concept of the state of Florida defending unconstitutional laws. And so, the governor has had money allocated for legal defense on unconstitutional laws. The governor has been allocated money to traffic asylum seekers to other states. So there's definitely opportunities to pull back some of the excessive spending of the executive office of the governor. There's $10 million that went missing because the governor and his administration allocated ACA settlement dollars to Hope Florida and then to political campaigns. So there are always opportunities for dollars to be more responsibly spent, but I would argue that Florida operates a very lean budget in the sense that our teachers are underpaid, our state agencies are underfunded and understaffed. So there's a lot of work that we can do in strengthening basic government operations and retaining strong state employees. Paul also asked, is TDT funds going to remain as they have in the past years? I will talk about that very soon in the concept of the tax package. Yes, and Katie writes, we were promised the lottery would never replace when it was voted in. Yeah, and that's not what happened. And also just to flag, like the Florida lottery is a very regressive program in the sense that those who participate in the lottery are predominantly folks who are low income and they don't always see the benefits of the tickets they're buying. And in fact, if you look at the demographics, not only is it predominantly folks who are low income, but it's predominantly people of color, especially folks that are in areas of concentrated disadvantage. And unfortunately, when you look at who receives bright futures, it does not reflect those who participate in the Florida lottery. So there is a serious issue of access here and equity in the sense of who buys lottery tickets and who actually sees the benefit of public education and bright futures. Yeah, and Kathy is highlighting the role of private for-profit prisons in Florida. And exactly, that's a very concerning aspect of the conversation. Okay, so this graphic is a little fuzzy if I'm looking at it, so I'm sorry about that. But what this graphic was going to show you was also just how reliant Florida is on sales tax, which I already talked about. But it does mean that we have a very regressive tax structure in the sense that folks who make less money end up paying more of their annual income to taxation when you break it down by a ratio because we don't have an income tax. So it's a reason why people love living in Florida is we don't have an income tax, but you end up paying your your share into the state coffers through different ways, and the burden is not evenly shared. And I would add that, we might have low taxes, then we have high risk with things like storm impact. So we have high property insurance, right? Because the state isn't mitigating risk because they don't have money to mitigate risk. So there is some other dynamics to be aware of where you might not be paying a lot to government, but you are paying a lot to private actors on things you're required to pay for. And of course, you're not getting government services to the way that other states are able to provide support. So I think it's important to also think about the state budget as deficits that are not necessarily quantitative, but they're qualitative. So, what is the role of the tax package? So, I'm the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, and I also serve on the Special Select Committee on Property Taxes. So, this is a conversation. Like, I work on the tax package every single year, and one reason why there is a no agreement on the Florida on the budget right now is because there's no agreement on the tax package. So every year, every legislative session, we pass a tax package. This outlines the tax programs of the year. And remember, any tax break that we create is less money that comes into the state budget. So that's why there's so much tension right now between the House and the Senate, because there's a disagreement on how much money should be allocated through tax breaks, with the Speaker of the House wanting to create a permanent reduction in sales tax, which would impact the state budget by about $5 billion. And that's likely not going to happen because it's such a large reduction in the state budget. But there are other types of tax breaks. I mean, every year we do about $1 billion of tax breaks. So there will be tax breaks this year, but the debate is over where, how, and who, right? Who benefits? Is it going to be corporate tax breaks, business tax breaks, or consumer tax breaks? And so that's the heart of a lot of the debate that we're having right now. And as you can imagine, I want to see consumer tax breaks. I don't want to see corporate tax breaks, but those discussions impact the amount of money that the legislature can then allocate to silos. Really quickly, we had a roundtable discussion with other elected officials earlier this week on property taxes. This is another issue of debate right now. Governor Ron DeSantis has been pushing to eliminate property taxes. Meanwhile, there's been a larger conversation on how do you replace that revenue without creating a more regressive tax structure, because the only clear way to replace property tax revenue would be to raise sales tax, which is again very regressive and also not sustainable because sales tax revenue declines when there's economic downturn compared to the stability of property tax revenue. And of course, property taxes stay local. It does not fund the state budget, it funds your local government budgets. So it goes directly towards things like public education, police, fire, trash pickup, stormwater management. And so it's a really important source of revenue for locals, and there's no clear answer of how that money will be replaced. Um, I also mentioned the TDT already, tourism development tax. So Paul asked, are there changes happening to TDT? There could be changes to the TDT. So the Florida House and Florida Senate both have competing proposals. The House is quite radical, in the sense that it's a huge change. It would take any TDT revenue and require local governments to use it to offset property taxes. The Florida Senate, which is Carlos Guillermo Smith's language, sets more flexibility for the TDT by allowing local governments to allocate the dollars towards other infrastructure needs or not just promotion of tourism. And so I don't see the House version moving forward at all. But the Senate version could still be in play. But the House version was really a part of Governor DeSantis's efforts and the Speaker of the House's efforts to compete on their different tax proposals. So I do not see that idea moving forward, but I do think that there could still be an opportunity for flexibility with the TDT in the next few weeks to come. And we'll, of course, keep you in the loop on that process. So this image here is how an idea becomes a law. Again, I shared this last week, so I won't go into all the details. But what I will say is that the budget goes through a somewhat similar process, but it's a little bit more complicated. So when you think about the way a typical bill moves through the process, so I'm a lawmaker. I have an idea for a bill. I draft the bill language and I file it. It gets a bill number. Based on the bill's topic, it will get assigned by the speaker's office to different committee stops. And my job to pass this bill is to move this bill through those committees with successful votes, right? So depending on the type of bill, it typically just needs 50% plus one to pass a committee. Obviously, it's great to have unanimous bills, but your goal is to move that bill through the process to the House floor. The budget is a little bit different in the sense that you do have bill numbers, but it's not amended the same way a traditional bill is amended. And what eventually happens, you just have one bill that is the budget. And then you have conforming bills that are specific to each budget silo. So the screenshot that I have here on the upper left corner outlines each committee and subcommittee that is related to the state budget on the House side. And then the screenshot I have on the bottom of this page is the Florida Senate committees and subcommittees. So, for example, you have a main budget committee. This is one of the largest committees in the Florida House. And under the budget committee, you have subcommittees. Each subcommittee is a specific silo, right? So you have agriculture, natural resources, healthcare, higher education, information technology, justice, which is the like all the judicial areas of funding, like the court system and so forth, pre-K 12 budget, state administration budget, and then transportation economic development budget. So those are all the subcommittees. We refer to these as silos. These are budget silos. And then the Florida Senate has a very similar structure. You have the main appropriations committee, but then you have specific silos, right? Appropriations committee on agriculture, environment, and general government, appropriations committee on criminal and civil justice, appropriations committee on health and human services, on another one on higher education, pre-K 12, and then transportation, tourism, economic development. As you can tell, the names are very similar to each other, but they're not 100% the same. There are more House budget committees than there are Senate. So, for example, there's like, looking at some of the contrast. So, transportation, economic development sounds very similar to the Florida Senate's, but then like we have a technology subcommittee. The Florida Senate doesn't have that, right? But technology issues would probably fall under the Appropriations Committee on Agriculture, Environment, and General Government. So at the end of the day, there are different committee names, but the silos would intersect. So we're all working on the same budget. And there's two headshots here. One is Chair McClure, one is Chair Hooper. So these are the two individuals that chair the appropriations committees in the Florida House and Florida Senate. These are two very important people to know because they are the ultimate deciders and negotiators for their respective chambers. Chair McClure is a House member, Chair Hooper is a senator. And so they're the two negotiating leaders of our chambers. over the components and the allocations and the ultimate amount of the state budget. So what ends up happening, and I'm going to go through the process right now, is the two chambers will basically craft their own budgets. So to go through these 7 steps with you, step one, as a reminder, the Florida budget is known as a General Appropriations Act. And before we even get to session, the first part of this process is the governor issuing their recommended budget. And this often happens, maybe like 2 months before session starts, 3 months before session starts, where the governor issues their recommended budget. It really doesn't matter, honestly. Like we take it as a recommendation, but again, the legislature is who crafts the budget, so we don't have to do what the governor wants us to do, but it is part of the process, and the governor gives us their recommended budget. So we review that proposal. Then, of course, we also come up with our own budgets based on leadership priorities. So what I mean by that is the Florida House and the Florida Senate will craft their own draft budgets. And of course, there are parts of this process. So speaking to the House side, we will file, and I'll talk about this in a second, but we'll file appropriation requests. So, like, I will specifically file funding requests for District 42. I will also meet with the budget chair and the budget vice chair to share our priorities as it pertains to our constituents' needs. So, oftentimes, when I talk to the budget chairs, we're advocating for overall increases to affordable housing programs, mental health programs, arts and culture funding. So, my job in this process is to only advocate for the specific appropriation projects that I have filed on behalf of constituents, but also in advocating for these larger macro levels of funding. Agency for Persons with Disabilities, for example, right? The needs that our constituents uplift to us. We're also advocating with the main budget chair, but also the related subcommittee. So, for example, if we're talking about funding for affordable housing or arts and culture funding, that falls under the subcommittee on economic development and tourism. And I will go to that chair, who is Representative Jason Schoaf, and I will talk to him about our priorities. So while this step-by-step process is important, there's a lot happening behind the scenes with lawmakers and advocacy groups and lobbyists who are all essentially, vying for their piece of the budget, right? And then, of course, eventually the House and the Senate will pass their own budgets, and then we have to go into a process called conferencing, where the House and the Senate come together to build one budget. And that's where the hiccup is right now, because there is no agreement on what the size of the budget will be and what the tax package will be. Though the House and Senate have passed their own budgets at this time, their own draft budgets, we have not started the process of conferencing. We have not started the process of the House and Senate coming together to debate a budget. Um, so what is the legislative budget? What is the LBR, a legislative budget request? So an LBR refers to an agency of the state government requesting specific funding for their needs, whether it's they're having trouble retaining staff, and so they're asking for salary increases. Maybe they need more, they need different types of vehicles. Like if it's FDLE, they might be asking for funding of deferred maintenance or funding for different vehicles or heavy equipment. It might be program dollars if you're DCF, if you're asking for more program dollars. But an LBR essentially outlines the agency's budget needs and requests, and they go before legislature to make that request. The Florida University System, under the Board of Governors, the BOG, is one of those actors who will give a presentation to the Florida legislature. Oftentimes, LBRs are included in the governor's recommended budget as well, but the agency heads will go before legislature in the subcommittees to give their pitch of why they need these dollars and what it would go towards. So I have an example here of like, an LBR from 2021, from DBR for the Florida Gaming Control Commission, right? This was their request for funding, and of course, it doesn't mean it's going to get funded, but they're asking legislature to consider funding them. They also have what I alluded to earlier called a state appropriation request, also known as an APR. So this is when members of the public, nonprofit organizations, local municipalities ask us lawmakers to request money to go to them for a specific reason. So we will file APRs on behalf of, like I said, nonprofits, local governments. We've actually been very successful in the past with APRs. For example, we were able to secure $1.2 million to support Lock Haven Chain of Lakes through an organization called Friends of Lock Haven Chain of Lakes to fund a water quality study and hopefully then fund water quality improvement projects. So you basically want to find someone in the House and the Senate to file your request. And then you, as the advocate, with the lawmaker would work to get this in one of the budgets. As long as your APR is in one of the budgets, one of the draft budgets in that initial process, then you have a chance of being in the final budget. During conferencing, there's debate over matching, right? So let's just say maybe the House budget has, um, you know, $500,000 for a local nonprofit that does human trafficking prevention, but the Senate budget doesn't have that. Part of my goal, if that was my project, would be to go talk to the senators and say, can you please match line, 87 in your budget. So you basically fight to try to get that line item in each other's budget. And sometimes it's not at 100%. So maybe the appropriation request that I made was for $1 million, but the Florida House put 50% of it in their budget. The Senate has zero. Maybe I can get the Senate to go to 250, and then the House either stays at 500 or eventually moves down to 250. Once they match in the conferencing process, it gets shaded and it means that there's agreement on that item. You can now, rest easy knowing that at least you secured some funding for your APR. Now, it was mentioned in the chat earlier about line item vetoes. So the governor does have the power to veto any line that they want. And this is why last year Governor Ron DeSantis vetoed the entire arts and culture funding because he vetoed these programs. He didn't veto individual projects. He vetoed entire arts and culture programming. And so the governor does have that authority. Of course, we also have the power if we have 2/3 of support to override vetoes. But as you can imagine, doing so is difficult. And the Florida House actually has voted to override some vetoes from last year, but the Florida Senate has not matched our efforts in that regard. But with that said, the APR process is an important one for nonprofits to be aware of. It's a way that you can try to um, I, identify state dollars for your programming. And of course, those dollars have to be spent within the fiscal year and has to be spent by the criteria you outlined in the APR. So you can't get the money and spend it in a different way. You have to also report how you're spending it to the reflective state agency. So there is oversight in how you spend those dollars. And then what I just described, I designed this visual representation for everyone because I know I'm a visual learner. So this just provides, a breakdown of that step-by-step process. So to quickly review it, you have the governor's recommended budget. The legislature reviews and hears presentations from different state agencies on their LBRs. And then there are going to be separate House hearings and Senate hearings to craft a budget that is respected to both chambers. Then legislative leaders agree on allocation. So, what is an allocation? An allocation is the amount of money per silo. So, once the House and Senate agree on the total amount of the budget based on what the tax relief will be this year, then that gets divided into the different subcommittees that I outlined earlier. So if we just use easy numbers, let's just say that the total budget is 150, let's just say it's $100 billion. Then the allocations would be, okay, 40 billion is going to go towards this education, 50 billion will go towards healthcare, 10 billion goes towards the judiciary. So allocation just refers to the amount of money you have to then get into the weeds with the specific line items. And then obviously after that, when you get through conferencing and a final budget is agreed upon by the House and the Senate, there is something called the sprinkle list. This is basically there's in most cases there's typically leftover money, right? Because the budget is so big that you go through this entire conferencing process. You agree to disagree on different lines in the budget. And then at the end of it, there might still be like not a lot of money unallocated, but maybe there's like $5 million unallocated. The sprinkle list is the last minute list of funding where essentially the chairs, the appropriation chairs, can handpick projects that they want to give money to that either they want to put more money towards it or it's a completely new project that didn't get funded in the process. So the sprinkle list is, the reason why it's called that is that you're sprinkling money on things, but it's often comes up at the very last step. So the budget has already been approved by the chairs and the conferencing process. And then when we're voting on the budget, a sprinkle list shows up. Very important to remember that there is a cooling off period. So before we can vote on a budget, it has to land on our desks or in our inboxes with 3-day notice. So we can't vote on a budget until it cools off after 3 days. And then, of course, the budget is sent to the governor. Once we do pass it, the governor has the opportunity to veto line items. And then eventually you have a new budget. So that's the visual representation of what I just described. So I'm going to move through this really fast because I got a 5 o'clock outside and I don't want to get disconnected again. But I'm seeing a lot of questions about the impact of the federal budget. So I spoke to this already, and the town hall that I have here at 5 o'clock with Congressman Frost is going to talk more about the federal budget. But what I do want to emphasize is that Florida is very reliant on funding from the federal government. I outlined a few examples, but there are many, many, many examples. The most obvious one is Medicaid. This is one of the largest line items in Florida's state budget. Changes in the federal match rate will absolutely impact the amount of money that Florida receives for some of the most vulnerable people in our state, including people with disabilities, the elderly, folks who are low income, folks, new moms. I mean, it's a huge, huge, huge need in our state to have a strong Medicaid reimbursement process. And we don't even have a strong one as it is, right? Like our reimbursement rate in Florida is very low. We should be strengthening it, not weakening it. Then you have education. So obviously, whether it's disability programming and services or IEPs or Pell Grants, I mean, all of that intersects with the federal government. We have transportation dollars, of course, disaster relief. So Florida is very reliant on FEMA reimbursements. We typically have to spend upfront for disasters, but then we get reimbursed later by FEMA. So not having that reimbursement is very concerning and doesn't just impact the state government. In fact, local governments also get reimbursed by FEMA. If there's a federal declared disaster, so not having FEMA is very, very, very concerning. And then of course, nutrition programs, right? Whether it's free reduced lunch in our schools or it's food stamps and TANF and WIC, all of these programs are administered typically by the state of Florida, but they are federally funded. And so if Congress cuts these programs, then our state would have to make up the difference or cut services. So very, very, very concerning. And then I want to take a few minutes to talk about funding for public education because there's been a lot of questions around this, especially House Bill 5101, which is proposing major cuts to public education funding, specifically in the context of these enhanced educational courses like AP and IB and so forth. So first of all, to level set here a little bit, Florida's public K-12 education system is funded through a mix of several revenue sources, state funds, as I mentioned, um, sales tax and other type of general revenue dollars, Florida lottery, local funds, and that's primarily property taxes from school districts, and then federal funds for specific programs like, Title I, school lunches, so forth. Florida also has what's called the FEFP. This is the Florida Education and Finance Program. This is a core formula that Florida uses to distribute funding to school districts. It was established in 1973 to ensure that funding is equitably distributed based on student need and local district ability to raise revenue. So essentially, the FEFP is a formula that is created with the intention of ensuring that we meet the state's constitutional requirement to provide high quality education to all of our students. The FEFP takes into account a few variables. One is something called the BSA, which stands for the base student allocation. This is a set amount per student determined each year by legislature. So when you hear the rhetoric around per pupil spending, that often refers to the BSA. This is the amount of money that is allocated to each student for their educational needs. And the school district um, uh, allocates these dollars towards whatever needs are prioritized to meet the student's needs. So it can be teacher pay and other types of programming and so forth. There's also weighted factors. These are extra funds for students with additional needs, like students with disabilities, ESOL classes. So it might be school districts that have more of these weighted factors than others, and that also is supposed to influence the FEFP. Um, District cost differentials. These are adjustments for cost of living expenses. And then something called the LRE. I'm sorry, the RLE, which is the required local effort. This is the minimum amount that each school district must contribute using local property taxes. And as you can imagine, the state of Florida has really shifted the burden towards local effort and creating an imbalance between how much the state helps compared to what local governments are expected to do. And I see a question from John. Is it true that charter schools get paid by Florida taxpayers? Yes, that is true. It's actually worse. It's not even just charter schools, which are typically still defined as public schools, though obviously they don't have the same requirements to meet as a public school, a traditional public school would. What's worse, I would argue, is the fact that billions of dollars of our tax dollars are going towards private schools through vouchers. And this is basically where that the BSA that I mentioned, it's almost like you get a coupon with the BSA and you could spend that really however you want. And it could go to private schools that have no accredited teachers, no type of accountability metrics, and of course, mixed results in their educational outcomes. And that is what is pulling billions of dollars away from public education right now. And that is why even school districts like Orange County are having to lay off teachers despite the fact that we have a teacher shortage because of disenrollment. Because remember, when you lose students to other places, that impacts the total amount of dollars a school district has to allocate back into the school system. So if you lose revenue through the BSA, then you cannot provide the same programs you've historically provided. And it gets worse because it's not even just the funding dynamic. The legislature is also just creating an uneven playing field by making it easier for charters and private schools with vouchers to operate while also creating disadvantages for traditional public schools. And one of the most recent examples I can give you is there was a bill this year that would allow private school students to play on the sports teams of public schools. And they don't even have to pay anything unless the school has an athletic fee that everyone pays. So, for example, if you're a private school student, but your school doesn't have a football team and you want to play on the football team, this would allow you to play on a football team with a public school, even if you're not paying into the program. So it again is continuously creating a disadvantage for what public schools have to offer by preferencing private options. So it really is part of a long-term effort to just defund public education, to resegregate our schools, and to reduce the educational outcome for our kids. Um, with real quick, I gotta wrap this up. There are a few other topics I want to highlight. Categorical funding. These are special purpose dollars outside the FVP formula. School safety officers. That's one of the examples. Like that's separate. And the legislature has school safety dollars. It's never enough, but it is one of the categoricals. Transportation. Sometimes there's a categorical funding just for teacher salary increases. Oftentimes these dollars don't have as much flexibility for school districts. And then I already mentioned the Florida lottery, which again doesn't necessarily add on to funding, but it allows for the state to shift dollars to something else. Um, and then talking about federal funding. So I already talked about how the federal government contributes a lot to our education budget. And I talked about charter schools already. So, and voucher schools, but they also receive per pupil spending like any other public school would. And then as I mentioned, 2023, Florida created universal vouchers, allowing even wealthy families to use taxpayer funds for private tuition. And this is a huge negative impact on our public schools. So I want to talk about this issue regarding funding for AP, IB, Cambridge, dual enrollment, and other types of career and professional education courses for high school students. Right now, there is a proposal that would lead to a reduction on what's called add-on full-time employees by 50%. And this would create losses across the state of Florida for public schools. In fact, it's estimated in Orange County that we would see a reduction of $17 million for our AP, IB, these higher level classes. And of course, many of these programs do have a higher cost. And it seems that the legislature is ignoring that point by putting by reallocating dollars towards the BSA. And the only reason why, in my humble opinion, that you see an increase in the BSA is because private schools can also get BSA. So when you see the legislature saying they're increasing per pupil spending, I first of all, they're not increasing it in a substantial way. But second of all, they're doing it because voucher schools would also benefit from a BSA increase. So they're increasing the BSA to the detriment of traditional public schools and would lead a situation where public schools would have to essentially pull back their budgets and impact these really important opportunities for students to get a head start to college, to save money on college, and of course, having the option of these programs like AP and IB entices families to choose public education. So when you pull these programs back, you're also making it harder for public schools to survive. Um, so real quick, just the timeline. I already mentioned that July 1st is our timeline, right? For the state budget. So this is the time to get active in advocating for more public education funding, for advocating to protect AP classes, for advocating for arts and culture funding. Like this is the time to get involved, to contact your state representatives and state senators, because literally there's never been such a rare opportunity where the only real topic on deck is the budget, right? When when we're in the regular session, we're working on multiple issues at the same time. This is a rare opportunity where the only issue we're really talking about is the budget. So, as an advocate, it's like the best part, the best time to get plugged in because there's no other distractions. You can hone in on this one topic and really make a difference. And so, if you're advocating for an APR, right? And again, this is a appropriation request. This is you as an advocate have a specific request of funding. I would encourage folks to create some sort of one pager or a bullet points about their request. What is it funding? How will it benefit the state of Florida? What's the ROI on it? You can include personal stories, other data points. Like, for example, in arts and culture funding, we often speak to the ROI, the return on investment. When you put in a dollar to arts and culture funding, the state gets, the local economy gets $9 back, right? Um, Target your information. So identify which silo is your request. So, for example, if you are making a request for, let's just say, environmental, maybe you want, um, you're requesting $500,000 go towards a specific water project, then you would want to target your advocacy towards the chair of both of the natural resources subcommittees in the House and the Senate, and of course the main chair and vice chair as well. So that's how you would make sure that your advocacy is going towards the correct people. You always want to loop in your lawmaker as well, assuming they're the ones who filed your request for you. Hopefully they should already be plugged in, but hold your own lawmaker accountable regardless of what role they're playing. You can encourage others to call on your behalf too, encourage others to contact those budget chairs and vice chairs. And then of course, track the progress, follow the process to see if you made it into one of the budgets. If you didn't make it into one of the draft budgets, it's okay. Like obviously, getting it through that year is very difficult. but you can try again next year. I know it's a hard pill to swallow, but especially for first timers, I always remind first timers that it can take several attempts for a new APR to get into a budget. And so don't feel disappointed by that. You've learned the process, you're going to become an expert at it, and just definitely try again, right? Um, and this is this is generic advice to just how to advocate for funding in totality, right? Especially, like I said, public education funding. Identify the chair, vice chair, and ranking member of the subcommittee for this specific silo in both chambers. Contact them and express your position, include data, personal stories. If possible, come up to Tallahassee to advocate on these issues. And of course, work with an organization that is leading the charge. I do want to flag too that there are opportunities to talk in a committee room about this. So, for example, during budget conferencing, and again, this is the process where the House and the Senate will have public meetings to agree on different lines in a budget, in a silo of the budget. They always open up for public commentary. It's very rare that people testify because unfortunately these meetings are scheduled sometimes with only a 2 hour notice. But there is an opportunity to testify on the conferencing process and to say, we really like the House's version. Can you please accept the House's version on this? Or we don't like any version. We want to see more money towards public education. So obviously, if you're in Tallahassee, it's a lot easier for you to show up in those meetings. But I would say that if you are someone who really, really wants to get involved in this way, if you have any flexibility in your schedule to be in Tallahassee during budget conferencing and to keep near the Capitol, so with 2 hour notice, you can come to a meeting, that's another great way to be heard of the process. And of course, you can also talk to individual lawmakers during that time as well. But budget conferencing is a good time to come to Tallahassee if the budget is your main issue. If you go to flhouse.gov, you can see budget documents. I unfortunately don't have time to do a screen share tonight, but I do encourage you to check out these two links so you can see the main budget documents. And then here you can look at all the APRs. You can actually look at every APR that is filed by the legislature. And so individual member projects you can check out on that link. Okay. All right. So this is a always my default slide, ways to get more involved. So, like I said, come to delegation meetings in your district, in your community, go to public meetings, be involved, engage in community outreach, help support lawmakers or issues you care about by volunteering with them and tabling and spreading awareness. Get involved with your PTA, get involved with, if you care about environmental funding, get involved with the Sierra Club, get involved with Florida Springs Council, a lot of great organizations that would love, love, love your involvement that are engaging on the budget. Contact lawmakers, do voter registration, right? A lot of great ways to get involved in this process, especially if it's your first time doing it. And so that wraps up our budget presentation. I'm grateful I got this done in an hour, and I appreciate y'all's patient with me and my technology channels. But we will make sure we upload this recording on our Facebook page alongside our YouTube channel. And we will make sure that if you RSVP'd for this training, you'll get the slides as well. But it's just really important that we engage in the budget process alongside the policy fights because a budget is a moral document of a state or a community's priorities. So what we fund and don't fund speak to what our priorities are. And as you've probably seen, budgets have often been weaponized, right? We see President Trump withholding funding to push for control, withholding funding as a tool of coercion. And obviously, some of what he is doing is not constitutional and it is being challenged right now. But it's important for us to also engage at the fiscal level, not only because these are your tax dollars being allocated to different issues and needs, but ultimately it does speak to our values. Do we believe in free speech? Do we believe in taking care of the most vulnerable? Do we believe in the importance of public education? Do we believe in in infrastructure improvements that keep us all safe? Do we believe in paying our teachers more, right? Do we believe in supporting law enforcement, supporting first responders, and supporting DCF, child welfare advocates, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Do we believe in a functioning unemployment system? Do we believe in strong safety nets, right? Like at the end of the day, if those are policies you care about, it all ties back to the budget. It also ties back to the tax package. Do we care about tax relief for hardworking Florida families, or are we comfortable with more corporate tax breaks? So everything ties back to the budget, and I really hope this was helpful and give you some more insight to what is unfortunately a often often a less understood topic. So with that, I really appreciate y'all for tuning in. I wish I could grab some more questions, but I got to run to another town hall about budgets right now. So I appreciate y'all so much, and I know I'll definitely talk to y'all soon. Okay, thank you again, and shout out to the team for helping to organize this event as well. And we'll see everyone soon. Be safe, y'all. Thank you.